History remembers kings as visionaries, conquerors, or divine rulers. But beneath the crowns and beyond the palaces, something far more sinister took place. In sealed chambers and moonlit groves, they performed acts that had nothing to do with God, and everything to do with something older and darker. What vows were sealed in blood? What entities answered their midnight prayers? And what secrets still lie buried beneath ancient stone? Because some rituals were never meant for human eyes. And yet, kings performed them anyway. In the ancient world, a crown wasn't just a symbol of political authority, it was a sacred burden. Kings weren't merely rulers, they were conduits, living bridges between the divine and the mortal, tasked not only with governing their people, but with maintaining the cosmic balance. This belief, found in civilizations as far apart as in Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and Mesoamerica, framed the king as a high priest, a chosen vessel through which divine will flowed. But the divine, as understood by these ancient rulers, wasn't always kind. The gods of old weren't gentle shepherds, they were wild, volatile, and often cruel. They demanded loyalty, fear, and most of all, offerings. And blood was the purest offering of all. Unlike gold or grain, blood had power. It carried within it the mystery of life, the unseen energy that animates flesh and thought. Shedding it was never done lightly. Every drop spilled in ritual was a message written in the oldest language known to creation: pain, submission, and sacrifice. Rulers learned this early. A successful harvest could be coaxed with the blood of a lamb. But to stop a plague, to ensure victory against overwhelming odds, or to extend one's reign beyond what was natural, that required something more, something human. Children of slaves, captured enemies, virgins, sometimes even members of the royal family themselves. All were fair offerings when the throne was at stake. These weren't mindless acts of savagery. They were carefully orchestrated rites, carried out with precision, often by the king himself, to bind his fate to powers beyond comprehension, powers that didn't sit in heaven, but in the dark places beneath the earth, or behind the veil of the stars. And here lies the most disturbing truth. Many of these kings weren't deceived. They knew exactly what they were doing. They understood that the forces they served weren't gods in the traditional sense, not protectors, but parasites, entities that fed on fear, pain, and blood. But they didn't care, because in exchange, these entities offered the one thing no mortal could refuse: power, real power, the kind that bends nations, alters history, and outlives memory. That was the true bargain behind the throne. A legacy built not just on conquest or law, but on sacrifice. If one name embodies the darkest extremes of ritual power, it is Moloch, a god whose very mention conjures fire, sacrifice, and the annihilation of innocence. Unlike other deities who symbolized fertility, wisdom, or war, Moloch represented only one thing: the irreversible act of giving up what should never be given. His origins are scattered across time. In the Hebrew Bible, Moloch is referenced repeatedly as an abomination, a foreign deity to whom the Israelites were forbidden to offer sacrifices. Yet many did. The prophet Jeremiah denounced those who built the high places of Tophet in the valley of Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, a practice so horrific it was said never even entered the mind of God. The book of Leviticus declares that any who sacrifice their offspring to Moloch must be stoned to death. But this was not mere polemic. Archaeological excavations in Carthage, the Phoenician colony often linked to the worship of Baal and Moloch, revealed tophets, sacrificial burial grounds containing the cremated remains of thousands of infants and young animals. These urns, carefully arranged in ritual patterns, were often inscribed with dedications to gods such as Baal-Hamon and Tanit. While some scholars argue these were natural deaths, others, especially from the esoteric tradition, assert they are irrefutable proof of institutionalized child sacrifice, sanctioned by priests and endorsed by kings. Because this was not chaos, it was ceremony. Moloch's worship wasn't the cult of madmen, it was the religion of rulers. Kings and high priests offered not just the children of others, but in some of the darkest traditions, their own bloodlines, sons, heirs, firstborns, in exchange for protection, fertility, victory in war, or immortality of their name. A royal sacrifice was not just a gift, it was a declaration that the throne came before the future, that power was worth any price. In this sense, Moloch becomes more than a deity. He becomes the archetype of empire, the personification of the idea that greatness is built on blood. His fire is the engine of civilizations that rise rapidly, burn brightly, and fall tragically. And esoterically, this idea is not metaphorical. In the occult traditions of the West, Moloch is understood as one of the masks of Saturn, the devourer of time, the lord of limitation and sacrifice. Saturn devours his children to maintain dominion. Moloch demands children to sustain empires. Both are different faces of the same hunger. Philosophers such as Boethius, Eliphas Levi, and later Kenneth Grant interpreted Moloch not just as a god, but as a current of consciousness, a force that possesses the machinery of power, a parasitic intelligence that seduces rulers with promises of absolute control, in exchange for the lives of those they were meant to protect. And in that exchange, the king becomes a priest of entropy. Today, we recoil from the image of infants burned alive in the belly of a bronze idol, but that's because we imagine it as ancient, barbaric, extinct. What we forget is that power still demands sacrifices, and Moloch still wears many names. The grandeur of ancient Egypt, with its towering obelisks, golden tombs, and vast pantheon, has long mesmerized the modern world. But beneath the splendor of its monuments lies a truth far more unsettling. The Egyptian pharaoh was not simply a king, he was a god, and like all gods, he required offerings. In the spiritual cosmology of Egypt, every being was composed of multiple souls, and one of the most vital was the Ka, the vital essence, the energetic double, the animating life force. It was believed that when a pharaoh died, his Ka did not perish. It continued on, needing sustenance, servants, and in some cases, blood. Funerary inscriptions and tomb carvings across the Old Kingdom reveal disturbing details. Upon a pharaoh's death, entire retinues of servants, concubines, and soldiers were ritually slain to accompany him into the next world. These weren't symbolic sacrifices. These were real deaths, flesh and blood lives extinguished to serve a god in the afterlife. It was called the retinue of the Ka, and for centuries it was state-sanctioned ritual murder disguised as devotion. The logic was brutal but clear. A god-king required a court in eternity, just as he did in life, and no ordinary soul would suffice. Only those bound by blood, and often killed in precise ceremonial timing, could provide the necessary spiritual fuel to empower the Pharaoh's car on its cosmic journey. But this wasn't limited to funerals. Within temple walls, far from the eyes of the masses, rituals took place in honor of deities like Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and plague, feared for her insatiable thirst for blood. In myth, she once slaughtered humanity with such frenzy that Ra had to drug her with dyed beer to calm her rage. But in reality, her priests were tasked with feeding her rage. And there are ancient texts that suggest that in times of famine, disease, or invasion, human blood was offered at her altar. Sekhmet was chaos incarnate, the flame that purifies through destruction, and pharaohs, who often claimed descent from Ra himself, invoked her power to annihilate enemies, restore balance, or cement their dominion. To do this, they didn't just offer incense, they offered lives. And the Ka, that mysterious, flickering life force, was not always metaphor. In the esoteric interpretation of Hermetic Egypt, the Ka could be manipulated, harvested, and even stolen. Blood rituals weren't just about honoring the dead, they were a form of energetic transference, a sacrifice that fed the soul of the ruler, strengthening his spirit across dimensions. In short, Egyptian kings were not content to rule the earth. They sought power in the afterlife, and they were willing to kill to take it with them. There is no civilization on Earth where blood and power were more intimately entwined than in the heart of the Aztec Empire. To be emperor in Tenochtitlan was not to rule with law. It was to hold the universe together with the blade. The Aztec Tlatoani, the one who speaks, wasn't just a king. He was the chosen of the sun, believed to be placed on Earth by Huitzilopochtli himself, the war god who demanded blood in return for light. Every sunrise was bought. Every heartbeat of the empire was pulsing with sacrifice, because without it, the cosmos would collapse. At the center of the empire stood the Templo Maya, a towering double pyramid where rituals were performed to sustain the divine order. From its blood-slicked stairs, priests, often guided or observed by the emperor, performed sacrifices that shocked, even hardened Spanish conquistadors. Victims were led to the top, laid on a stone, and their hearts were cut out with obsidian blades and offered to the sky, still beating. Their blood spilled down the steps as a reminder to the people below. This is the price of existence. But the horror didn't end there. These bodies were often flayed, dismembered, or tossed down the pyramid to be processed for ritual use. And the heads? They were displayed on the Tzompantli, massive racks of skulls outside the temple, visible from every corner of the plaza. These weren't symbols of cruelty. They were part of a sacred system, the architecture of divine order. Estimates from both Aztec codices and Spanish chroniclers speak of tens of thousands of sacrifices during major festivals. During the rededication of the Templo Maya in 1487, sources such as Duran and Sahagun report that over 20,000 people were sacrificed in just 4 days. Modern archaeology has uncovered towers made of hundreds of real skulls, mortared into place, a Tzompantli not of myth, but of bone. And the emperor, he was there, not as a spectator, but as a consecrated channel. He didn't merely approve the bloodletting, he embodied it. In Aztec metaphysics, the emperor was a living link between the earthly realm and the divine. His bloodline was sanctified by suffering. His legitimacy was tied not to politics, but to pain. But here is the question that haunts this legacy. Was the emperor a tyrant or a puppet? Because deeper Aztec traditions, especially those passed orally and hinted at in esoteric codices, suggest something disturbing: that the gods did not simply ask for blood, they possessed; that the emperor, through fasting, drug rituals and bloodletting, entered trance states where his will was no longer his own. He became a vessel through which Huitzilopochtli could act. The sacrifices weren't his orders. They were divine compulsions channeled through his flesh. And this changes everything, because if the throne of Tenochtitlan was truly a sacred altar, then the man who sat upon it may have ruled millions, but he never ruled himself. He was ruled. The Aztec emperors ruled through blood in broad daylight, but in medieval and early modern Europe, the rights of power didn't vanish. They simply slipped behind closed doors. The altar didn't disappear. It just changed daydads, idioma. As cathedrals replaced temples and Latin hymns drowned out the cries of victims, kings and nobles across Europe wrapped themselves in holiness. Yet beneath the surface of the divine right of kings lay a different kind of divinity, one far older, far colder, and still hungry. Power hadn't become sacred. It had simply become secret. Among the whispers of history, one name emerges again and autre vez: the black nobility. Elite bloodlines in Venice, France, and the Holy Roman Empire traced not just to land and wealth, but to ancient priesthoods, protectors of forbidden knowledge, descendants of Rome, Babylon, and beyond. According to esoteric tradition, these families never stopped practicing blood rites. They simply buried them in protocol, law, and liturgy. The offering didn't stop. Only the public spectacle did. And then came the Knights Templar, once hailed as protectors of Christendom. Their meteoric rise in wealth and influence terrified the French crown. But their sudden downfall in 1307 was not merely political, it was theological. Accused of worshipping a horned figure known as Baphomet, of spitting on the cross, of engaging in secret oaths and blood rituals, they were tortured, tried, and burned. But the consistency in their confessions under torture raised questions even their enemies feared to answer. But what was Baphomet? To the Church, a heretical invention. To occultists like Eliphas Levi, a symbol of duality, the union of opposites, of male and female, light and dark, above and below. But to some, Baphomet was something more, a gatekeeper, a being at the threshold of hidden power. And those who invoked him, through blood, through oaths, through silence, weren't merely heretics. They were transgressors of a spiritual order far older than Rome. And the pattern didn't stop there. A century later, Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France and once hero alongside Joan of Arc, was convicted of the ritual murder of children in the pursuit of alchemy, power, and communication with infernal forces. He was said to have drawn sigils in blood, to have summoned beings beyond this world, and to have paid the price in human flesh. Then came Elizabeth Bathory, the blood countess, whose servants testified she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. In her isolated castle, far from the eyes of church and empire, she allegedly turned murder into medicine, not for healing the body, but for nourishing something far deeper, something spiritual, or perhaps inhuman. These figures, surrounded by wealth and status, were not anomalies, they were symptoms. Because the deeper you dig into the lineage of European monarchs, the more you find a recurring theme: the throne as a legacy of offering, not of benevolence, but of pact, not of divine gift, but of blood-earned right. Some researchers claim the coronation rites of certain dynasties retained hidden gestures, invocations, and relics, not Christian in origin, but pre-Abrahamic, even pre-human. Kings were not simply born, they were initiated. And here stands Baphomet again, not as a devil, but as a mask, a symbol of the sacred inversion, the price to be paid for absolute vision. His image, one hand pointing up, the other down, the torch between his horns, reminds us that all power comes at a cost, that no gate opens without blood, that sovereignty is never given, only bought. Perhaps that's why royalty was once believed to possess blue blood, not because of noble birth, but because the blood in their veins had already been promised, not to God, but to whatever answered them in the dark. We've seen the signs, from ancient empires to medieval courts, from pyramids dripping in blood to cathedrals hiding something far older than saints. And now, as we reach the final veil, a question rises, like smoke from a forgotten altar. What if the kings of the world were never just kings? What if they were something else entirely? Or worse, servants? The idea of the divine right of kings has long been used to justify the rule of monarchs. But what if that right didn't come from God? What if the covenant wasn't heavenly, but infernal? Occult genealogies, guarded in secret libraries and whispered through initiatory lodges, claim that certain bloodlines don't descend from ordinary human stock, that they were seeded generations ago through spiritual pacts with otherworldly entities. In the grimoires and Kabbalistic texts hidden from public view, these lineages are said to be marked, not by sin, but by permission, bound to forces that granted the power, vision, conquest in exchange for loyalty, sacrifice, and continuation. That's why, perhaps, royal blood had to remain pure, not for politics, not for tradition, but because the pact required it. Mixing with the common stock could dilute the current, the spiritual thread that fed their claim. It wasn't about love, it was about legacy, and what flowed in their veins may not have been entirely human. Is it coincidence that so many royal coats of arms feature dragons, phoenixes, lions with flaming tongues, or stars descending from the sky? Is it coincidence that initiatory orders like the Rosicrucians, the Golden Dawn, or the Ordo Templi Orientis obsess over genealogies, blood, and astral inheritance? Or that modern secret societies, shrouded in philanthropy and symbolism, continue to mimic these structures, from initiation rituals to symbolic sacrifices? And here's the most disturbing idea of all. What if it never stopped? What if somewhere, behind locked doors and encrypted networks, these bloodlines still maintain their part of the contract? What if the power behind thrones didn't die? It just moved off camera. Maybe the blood sacrifices are quieter now, masked behind wars, staged crises, controlled famines. Maybe the thrones have changed shape, no longer golden, but corporate, financial, digital. But the rules of the pact remain, because the kingdom must always be paid for. And now I ask you, if power this absolute was real, if the crown came not from bloodline, but from offering, what price would you pay to wear it? Power never comes free, and in the ancient world, its price was measured in flesh. We like to believe that we've evolved beyond such things, that kings no longer kneel before altars of bone, that no one sacrifices their own blood for the favor of forces they can't control. But the truth is simpler and far more disturbing. these rituals never vanished. They were whispered into new forms, disguised, perfected, and passed on. Look closely in the shadows of old families, in the architecture of forgotten empires, in the symbols that still hang above courtrooms and corporate towers. The same patterns remain. Because when the world changes, the old gods don't die. They adapt, and they remember who fed them. So ask yourself, if every crown hides an altar and every lineage has a pact, who really rules the world? If you want to go deeper into hidden rituals, forbidden gods, and the darkest corners of history, don't forget to subscribe, because the next chapter is already written, and the ink they used wasn't ink at all.